We are now moving to the panel on peace and technology, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Seaman, who, as you know, is the Assistant Director for the Bahá'í Chair. She has a degree in political science, does enormous, wonderful work in her research in international relations. So I would like Kate to please come up and introduce the panelists. Dr. Seaman.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. So I'm going to introduce the speakers and ask them to come up as I do so, and then we will get started. So on the panel today, we have Derek Caelin. He's an innovation specialist with Counterpart International in Northern Virginia. His focus is on the study and application of technologies and innovative processes for social good. Before joining Counterpart International, Derek worked at the PeaceTech Lab and the United States Institute of Peace, where he organized technology workshops in conflict zones including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. A former independent games designer, Derek has analyzed a variety of impact games, particularly games used for resolving or continuing conflict. He has a master's degree from the George Washington University, where he studied Middle East studies and conflict resolution, and you can reach him on Mastodon or follow him on Twitter at Derek Caelin. So if Derek can come up, please. Thank you. Up next, we have Maude Morrison. Maude is a conflict specialist focusing on the role of innovation in peace building. Working with Build Up, Maude supports local peace builders to design, test, and implement technology, tools, and processes that increase their peace building impact. She has supported projects across the world, from an app to track rumors about conflict in Myanmar, to a chatbot that connects job seekers and employers, and an interactive animation series that challenges perceptions of violence in Syria. Maude conducts regular research on the role of innovation in peace building, and her published work explores topics such as social media and conflict, the role of blockchain in conflict prevention, and innovative approaches to peace building in Syria. She's based in Beirut, Lebanon, where she leads Builds Up work on Syria, and Maude holds a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of International Affairs and a BA from the University of Oxford. So if Maude can come up as well. And then we also have Nanjira Sambuli on the panel today. Nanjira is a researcher, policy analyst, and advocacy strategist interested in and working on understanding the unfolding impacts of ICT adoption and how these impact governance, innovation, entrepreneurship, and societal culture, with a keen focus on gender implications. She is currently the Digital Equality Advocacy Manager at the World Wide Web Foundation, where she leads advocacy efforts to promote digital equality in access to and use of the web, with a particular focus on the Foundation's Women's Rights Online work. She previously worked at the iHub in Nairobi, where she provided strategic guidance for growth of technology innovation research in the East Africa region. So Nanjira can come up as well. And we're going to start with Derek. We're going to go in order of the program. And just make sure you... There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Test. This is working? I'm normally told I have a loud voice, so I'll do my best not to project too much. Okay, so my name is Derek Caelin. I'm an innovation specialist at Counterpart International, and I'm going to be talking today about video games. Games in general, but video games in specific, and how they relate to peace building and conflict. So if you were to ask me 5 years ago, should we be focusing on video games, I would say, oh yeah, it's this upcoming market, it's going to be great, it's going to be amazing. Now I can easily say it's here. Video games are a fact of daily life for 2.2 billion people around the world. 50% of the global gaming audience is female, and this is for everything from, console games that we traditionally think about as, quote, gamers, Xbox 360 to Xbox One to the PlayStation games, all the way to just your standard smartphone and in the web browser. For those who care about such things, it is a massively profitable industry. We're looking to have something close to $138.4 billion industry in the games market in 2021. So there's a lot of money, there's a lot of creative minds, there's a lot of people focusing on creating gaming experiences. And the question is, how do games, if they're being played by so many people, relate to peace building and conflict? And how can people intentionally make games that relate to peace building and conflict? Just as a warning, I'm going to be talking about both peace games and conflict games, and there may be a few violent images, so please be aware of that. Okay, so a little bit about me. I come from both the peace building space and the game design space. My master's was in Middle East Studies and Conflict Resolution. I spent about 4 years working at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the PeaceTech Lab, organizing technology conferences in conflict zones. But in my spare time, which I had a lot more of before I had a kid, I did a lot of work with independent game design, and I developed a couple of projects for iOS and Android, and attempted to break into the indie game space. And while I am still in the nonprofit sector, so you can tell how well that went, I'm actually fascinated by games and the way that these two spaces, peace building and games, which we don't often think overlap, can be put together. And I'm really interested in people who do it well. So what makes a game in this case? I'm going to use a pretty broad definition. I think that there are at least two really crucial components, one of which is that the medium is interactive, right? With traditional media, television, radio, a book, the medium is set. The narrative is already told. The frames are already locked in place. And while once they're projected to the audience and the audience is observing them, and that audience might interpret the TV show or the book or the movie differently depending on their circumstances and their background, frame by frame, right? Schindler's List is the same movie for pretty much everybody who sees it. Whereas with games are fundamentally an interactive system. There is some form of stimulus that you're reacting to. The player thinks about that stimulus, makes a choice or a decision, engages with some sort of interface, and the game responds accordingly. So that while many people may play the same game, that game experience may differ from person to person, and oftentimes games reflect the difference in choices that we are making when we play. So interactivity is a fundamental component of being a game. The other component that I think is super important is engagement. It's that part of a game that reaches into our brains and says, "Oh, I want to play more of this." And engagement is the thing that separates games from something like Google Street View, which, on the surface has a lot of similarities to games, right? It's an interactive system, you're exploring a digital environment, etc. But not a lot of people would consider it to be a game, right? And this focus on interactivity, on engagement, and why we play video games, I think is incredibly important, because it divides a lot of games from like, oh, well, there's this interesting simulation that could possibly be good for us, to a game, something that people want to play, something that engages people. And to that end, I'd love to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit of theory. So in game design, there's a theory called MDA, Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics. I'm kind of distilling it down into a more simple core for this presentation, but if you're interested, there's a link to a resource where you can learn more in my slide. And mechanics and aesthetics deal with how a game is built, what the rules are behind gameplay, and the aesthetics, the types of play. And understanding these is fundamental to making an engaging gameplay experience, right? So for the most part, players actually interact on the aesthetic level of game. Aesthetics are types of play. So it's the part of the game that makes people actually interested and want to experience more. And what's interesting to me is that even though we have hundreds of millions of games out there in the world and 10,000 are hitting the Google Play Store at any given minute, most games can be simplified down and abstracted down into a limited number of gameplay types. Some people say that it's 7, some people say that it's 8. The point is that a lot of the different games that we see fundamentally engage us in similar ways. If we understand those ways, we're a little bit able to apply them in our own games. And these aesthetics of play include things like challenge, because human beings fundamentally, we enjoy solving problems. We like being presented with a problem and knowing that we're the ones who have the solution and delivering that solution. Seeing the long piece in Tetris come down, like, ooh, that's challenge. It's games as an obstacle course. Fellowship is an incredibly powerful aesthetic. We are social creatures. Games allow us to interact with other people in a variety of ways, both collaborative, because humans tend to enjoy being a part of a group and achieving objectives with a group, being supported by people. We get a sense of pleasure from supporting others and feeling like the gratitude of others for our support. And also competition, because oftentimes human beings like to compete against somebody else who has opposing objectives and win. And sometimes games that rely on fellowship as an aesthetic employ both competitive and collaborative aesthetics, which is why team sports are so fascinating, I think. You have individuals working in concert with other individuals as a team, collaboration, and they're competing against other individuals working in collaboration as a team. So it's a complex system that's very satisfying. Games is narrative. We're still the same people that 100,000 years ago sat around the fire and told each other stories. With games, we have the ability to shape those stories and make the story something that we're not just passively listening to, but participating in, which is incredible. Expression. If you've ever spent an hour building a tower in Legos, or spent an hour building a tower in Minecraft, or spent an hour customizing your in-game avatar so you have just the right color mohawk or whatever, that's self-expression. It's the act of finding yourself inside a game and seeing your own identity reflected in the thing that you're interacting with. Games is discovery, the idea that people really enjoy unlocking new content, whether it's finding a new hat inside the game or finding a new skill as you progress through a leveling system, or literally within the game finding the horizon and going to it and seeing what's beyond it. This title right here is from 2011. It's from one of my personal favorite games called Skyrim. Despite the fact that it's now 7 years old, just about, it's still incredibly popular, and there's a huge player base for it. And part of the reason I think that Skyrim is so popular now is the fact that it taps into all these different aesthetics of play, because it's not just discovery, where you're climbing high mountains and going down into subterranean cities. There's challenge. You're solving puzzles. You're fighting dragons. There's sensation. The game is beautiful. There's expression. You can customize your character's armor and skill set. There's narrative. Thousands of storylines that you, the player, get to interact with and impact in some way. So the trick for designers is actually phenomenally challenging, because to get to these really satisfying aesthetics, you actually have to develop a system, right? You need to create the experience. And you can't just say like, okay, well, it's going to be an adventure game. You have to create the rules that establish that adventure game. And that's where you get something called mechanics, the rules of play. In chess, examples of mechanics include the way that pieces move, right? So bishops move diagonally, rooks move up, down, left, right, knights move in an L shape. Check is a certain set of circumstances where pieces are configured in a certain way. Checkmate is a more limited set of circumstances, right? And the beauty of games is that these rules interact with each other and assemble up to create this aesthetic framework, so that the rules of chess make a fundamentally engaging experience because they provide challenge, it's a big puzzle, and fellowship, specifically competitive fellowship, because it is a puzzle that we're trying to best the other person in solving, right? So it's hard enough with entertainment games to find a good way for the mechanics to assemble up into meaningful aesthetics. Imagine making an impact game, which is why we're here, after all. We're talking about changing the world. In addition to coming up with engaging aesthetics, you also need to come up with mechanics that serve some sort of impact function, whether it be changing the knowledge of the person who is playing the game, the attitudes, the behaviors, which is the gold standard, some sort of world change, right? Which is why some game designers start at the other end of the process and they say, okay, well, if we're trying to change the world, what is the change that we want to see? What are the elements of play reflected in that change? And then they develop the systems that way, right? This is the framework of shell games, which are, it's a very popular company within the edutainment game space. So I really appreciate their slides. So what impact can games have on conflict and peace building? I would say that there are at least two, right? One is internal impact and the other is external impact. Internal impact, as you'll see in my slides here, is something that I think peace games are a little bit more comfortable with. External impact we're still working on. But the idea with internal impact is that the change that's happening as a result of gameplay is the kind that's happening inside the player, right? You're changing somebody's attitudes, you're changing their knowledge, you're asking them to consider another perspective or to feel empathy with something, right? Explore the consequences of choices. One of the classic peace games of the past decade is a game called Peacemaker. It's literally, in some cases, provided as a textbook of a peace game, in which the player is put in a position of power in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they're basically said, okay, you're the Palestinian Authority leader, you're the Prime Minister of Israel, you need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Make choices, go. And the player is given a series of choices. They are counseled by a series of different voices saying, well, this will be the impact of your choices. And they make decisions on policy, on diplomacy, on whether to use force. And then they see the consequences of their actions, so that certain interest groups get angry or the economy moves in one way or the other, right? Using that framework that we talked about earlier, mechanics and aesthetics, you can see a series of mechanics, right? Players are given policy choices. Policy choices have consequences. Different interest groups want different policies. And they all assemble up into a kind of aesthetic experience of challenge, where the player has a really difficult task and they need to figure out how to accomplish it. And the impact that happens is that there's a knowledge change, because by virtue of playing the game, you have to learn a little bit more about the dynamics of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. There's an attitude change. Frankly, this is just talking from personal experience. I studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in grad school. I thought I knew all the solutions. I was going to walk into this game and resolve everything, and in 5 minutes, everything was on fire. So please don't put me in a position of power. But that's kind of amazing, right? You're given a kind of a simulation environment, and you're given a chance to test your own preconceived notions and see them fail. And that's actually a powerful thing about games that you don't often get to see in other forms of media. Another very different example, there's a web game that came out of a game jam, which is like a 2-day games hackathon, called We Become What We Behold. And the idea of the game is very simple. There's only like 2 or 3 mechanics. Basically, the player, oh no, I'm not logged in, so I'll have to describe it. The player is provided with a set of circumstances, or they're provided with a very simple scape where people are interacting with each other. And if you take a picture of that scene, it automatically gets shared on social media, and everybody in this environment reacts to it. And it starts out being pretty funny, like the video shows you take a picture of people wearing hats, and suddenly hats are no longer in style, and half the people wearing hats are very sad about this. But after a few minutes, and the game is only about 6 minutes long, something bad happens. A crazed square attacks. And things rapidly go downhill, where there's a conflict that emerges between the squares and the circles, and it gets pretty violent, and the system deteriorates, and then there's a scene of pretty terrible violence, which you, the player, are forced, in order to have this thing continue taking pictures of and sharing on social media. And the final scene of the game is that it is one that we're often confronted with in the news media today, right? So the game has a very simple argument about how media shapes world affairs and how we shape media. And you might argue with that perspective, or you might agree with it. But the point is that through creating this mechanical framework where you simply just have to take pictures and see the consequences of these pictures, the game kind of forces you to see the reality according to the theory of how things work that is proposed by the game's designer. You basically see their vision of how games impact our space. So there's a knowledge change. You learn about this theory, and you learn about what people think is the relationship between media and our daily lives. A commercial game, My Childleben's Born, came out this year. It's about Norway and the history of Norway after World War II. After the Nazi occupation ended, there were a lot of children who were born who had parents who were Nazi soldiers. And in Norway, these children were not very well accepted. Many of them faced abuse for much of their lives. And in the course of the game, you have to guide this young child and take care of them and provide them with, support and aid and love and comfort and empathy. It's a really difficult game to play. I have a 2-year-old and I have trouble getting through it. But you can see how mechanically, it's not too dissimilar from a Tamagotchi, really, if you remember those, right? Like, you have resources, you take care of a child. You make difficult decisions about how to spend your resources. And this assembles up into an experience where it basically asks people to show some empathy and learn some history so that we might not fall prey to those mistakes from the past. All right, so that's internal impact. And those are ways that we ask people to think differently or feel differently. External impact is changing the world outside of the player himself or herself. And to be honest, this is an area where peace games, I have yet to see many peace games that are able to really effectively operate in this space, where peace games are asking people to solve problems, perform tasks, crowdsource knowledge that is beneficial to peace building. Where you see a lot of innovation in this realm, or you see people doing it well, is in the sciences. Now an old game, but still relevant in 2018, is a game called Fold It, developed by the University of Washington, in which they gamified the folding of proteins, which I don't really know what that means, but what they basically said is, okay, there are real-world proteins that we need to establish. We need configurations of proteins that have shaped themselves in such a way that these little organelles on the side are, the hydrophobic ones are on the inside of a protein structure. Or, we want proteins that are as compact as possible. These are different requirements that the game has set, and then it provides points to players for achieving them in certain ways. The thing is that people have used Fold It to crowdsource the solutions to real-world scientific problems. So in 2013, I think it was, the Washington University got a team of Fold It players to try to work on a challenge around the production of a protein related to the generation of the HIV virus. I'll be honest, I don't remember and I can't really explain it well. But the point is that there was a scientific challenge that researchers had been trying to figure out for decades. And through the use of a crowdsourced platform where people were collaborating in this space, several hundred game players were able to arrive at a solution in the space of 13 days, which had a question that had stumped scientists for decades. So it's an example where simple rules about the folding of proteins and simple objectives assemble up into a challenging puzzle game that actually has some collaborative and competitive elements, and scientific knowledge is gained as a result. EVE Online is a really cool game. I don't know if anybody in the audience has played it. It's a massively multiplayer online game, one of those that has about an install base of 400, 500,000 players, and a small nonprofit called MMOS, or Massively Multiplayer Online Science, convinced them to basically integrate a game that had players process real-world scientific images and classify them. They took images from the Atlas Genome Project and turned them into a game where players were rewarded with in-game currency for saying, yes, this is an organelle, this is a protoplasm, and again, you see my deficiency in the science field. But as a result of creating this game, over the course of 2 years, about 300,000 citizen scientists classified something like 33 million images for science, and this database is about to be made public. So it's an incredible example of how, you know, this desire of humans to solve problems ends up getting applied to a scientific challenge and creating some real-world good through play. It's amazing. And it's not just in the science space. In 2013, a game called Half the Sky, the game, which was like the third permutation of Half the Sky, the movie, and Half the Sky, the book, came out, in which it asked players on Facebook to play puzzles related to the status of women in developing countries, and based off of their decisions, and occasionally at the prompting of the game, the players would provide funds towards causes like putting books in libraries in developing communities. And it also unlocked corporate donations to the same effect. So that's an example of games being used for some sort of social impact. But what about conflict, right? The reality is that games, effective games, all function in the same way. And the same tools that we might use to promote peace building can be used to continue conflict, or to shape people's understanding of conflict, or to get people to participate in conflict, right? They function in the same way. One of the most active actors in this space is Hezbollah, which is a political party and a military group in Lebanon, designated by a terrorist as a terrorist organization. And for many, many years, they have been producing video games that have the player interacting with conflicts that they've undergone in the past. So, for example, in 2007, they came up with a game called Special Force 2, in which the player reenacted the war that Hezbollah had with Israel in 2006, where Lebanese soldiers went across the border, got a border patrol, found an Israeli border patrol, and then captured 2 Israeli soldiers. And this is a gameplay mission, right? Here I am playing this game, and you can see the 2 Israeli soldiers there. In the aftermath of this, after they captured them, they hauled them back onto the Lebanese side of the border, and Hezbollah and Israel continued fighting, and eventually Israel had to negotiate to get the soldiers back. And this was proclaimed as a great victory. It was one of the few times in modern history that an Arab army achieved some victory of their objectives against Israel, which has a habit of winning most of its region's wars. And the game was rapidly produced as a result of this. But a year later, this game came out, which in game development time is very, very swift. And I could go into a whole bunch of detail about how the developers ended up doing it. They stole a commercial product, ripped out the commercial assets, and shoved new assets in. But the fascinating thing to me is that they rapidly created a game out of this historical event and provided it to their audience back in Lebanon and spread it out around the Arab world. I'm told I have to move quickly, so I'm going to just close on another recent game that came out, also created by Hezbollah, called Holy Defense, in which the player is a Hezbollah fighter in Syria, defending holy shrines in Syria against the Islamic State. And the opening mission actually sets the player in defending a shrine that was never actually attacked by, armed gunmen in reality, but in the game you're actually fighting against gunmen. And there's a whole narrative here about how games can be used to convey a story that the designers want to tell. And players of this game, I wish I had time to show you. There's a young boy in Syria in Lebanon whose father was killed in fighting in Syria. And for him, this is a personal thing. It's a manifestation of his own identity to play in this game as his father fighting against ISIS. So games have the ability to tap onto our identity in ways that we don't really expect. And we're not alone in it. Hezbollah is not alone in this. The US military has invested over the years millions of dollars in creating something called America's Army, which is a free first-person shooter that is comparable to commercial shooters, and it's a part of their recruitment strategy. So in closing, Games are a pervasive tool. They're everywhere around the world, and it's something that we should be using as peace builders in order to get our narratives out, to get people to think in constructive ways helpful to peace. Games are designed to influence knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and this is incredibly difficult to do. So work with a designer, work with a talented designer in order to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Maude Morrison. It's just on the desktop?
Yeah, it should be on the desktop.
I want to make it full screen. I guess on the technology panel, this shouldn't happen. I think if you go view full screen. Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing. And stay with us. I know it's the last panel of the day, and I really want to get to the discussion, so yeah. I'm going to talk about peace and technology in general. So this idea of innovating peace, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges and also some of the opportunities I see in this space. So at Build Up, the organization that I work for, we really believe that peace building can be done differently. And specifically, we believe that through innovation and technology, we can bring more people and different people into peace processes. And we think this is really important because we know that top-down, exclusive peace processes often fail to bring about sustainable peace. So if we can increase awareness, engagement, and participation in peace, then we may be more likely to bring about sustainable solutions. But this is not automatic. It's not that using technology or bringing innovation automatically brings about participatory peace. We have to do it in a deliberative way. And I'm going to argue today that it's only when we start talking about local innovation and locally designed technologies that we can really affect peace-building change. So I start with an example because I think it can be quite abstract to talk about peace-building and technology. So in Syria, there is an animator and a peace activist, and they come together to create animations that they share on Facebook that challenge conceptions of violence, that challenge conflict. And they have quite a bit of success. They have quite a lot of views. One of their videos is seen 19,000 times in Syria. But for them, this isn't enough. They ask themselves, okay, how can we actually make sure that we're engaging people in a dialogue about conflict? How can we make this go further than just views? So what they're doing right now is they're developing a series of storylines without endings. So stories that end on a cliffhanger, animation stories. And they're developing a Facebook chatbot, which, after you watch the video, interacts with the viewers and asks you what you think should happen in the story. And also engages the viewer in a conversation about the theme of violence and conflict. So when I talk about peace and technology, this is the kind of project that I want to talk about. Initiatives that elevate existing peace-building projects. Technology that can help peace builders reach more people, bring more people into the conversation. And that is what Build Up does. So Build Up is a peace-building organization that seeks to support peace builders to design, test, and implement innovations. Technology, but also arts, creative methods, participatory research, and so on. And we do it through 4 main project areas. So we conduct research on innovation and peace building, and it may be on a specific technology tool, like blockchain or video games. It may be on a specific context, like Syria, or on more general global trends in technology and peace building. We also work with local peace builders, not only local peace builders, but predominantly local, who are already doing peace building work and who want to bring innovation into what they're doing. And our flagship program in this area is called the Buildpeace Fellows Program.
So over 1 year, we support peace builders to design, test, and implement a technology tool or process to increase their impact. So we provide them with grant funding, coaching, mentorship, and networking opportunities. We do some of our own projects. We've just done a project to look at depolarization on Facebook and Twitter of political discourse in the US called The Commons. And we are also trying to build a community of practice around peace building and technology. We have an annual conference called Buildpeace, which is happening in Belfast this year at the end of the month. And we also have our alumni network of fellows who are building this community. We talked a little bit, Margarita talked a little bit this morning about PeaceTech, which is a kind of growing term to describe this sector. We're not just talking about peace-building initiatives that have a Facebook page or a website. We're talking about peace-building initiatives where technology is of strategic importance to the objective of the peace-building initiative. When we talk about technology, it's very broad-ranging. We're not just talking about high-tech. We also look at radio, film, SMS, low-tech. It's basically technology that allows you to share information, create, share, disseminate information. When we look at PeaceTech, we see kind of 3 main functions of technology for peace building. So 3 ways that technology can and is already impacting the peace building field. So the first function is around data. Technology helps us gather data in new ways, visualize data, and analyze data also in new ways. So some of you might have heard of the Una Hakika project, which tackles disinformation in the Tana Delta in Kenya. And they use basically SMS to collect reports about rumors at the community level. This is a technological way to gather data. The second function is around strategic communications. So we know that technology can enable us to share stories with more people, to reach more people, to create new narratives. So this is a project we did on the Sudan-South Sudan border using a participatory video methodology. So allowing communities to actually tell their own stories through video making. This can be a really effective advocacy tool, much more effective than traditional research methods. It allows communities to actually shape their own story rather than have somebody else tell it for them. And the third function is around dialogue and mobilization. So technology can bring people together across boundaries in new ways. It can create new spaces for people to mobilize around a specific topic. Again, some of you might know Syria. So it's a platform that brings together young people from different cultures through facilitated online dialogues. And yeah, this is a classic example of technology enabling new types of networking. So across all of these functions, I think you can begin to see a little bit how we view technology as a tool for participation. And again, we talked about it a little bit just now. Peace building, peace processes, negotiations often tend to be done by a small group, largely men. And when peace processes are exclusive and top-down, they don't always reflect the broad views of the population that's actually affected by conflict. So if we can bring more people in, not just more people, but different people, women, youth, vulnerable communities, and many more, then we have more chance of peace that actually reflects the problems of the communities. But, and I really want to emphasize this because we're not utopian about technology. Technology is just a tool, and what matters is the way we use it, the way we deploy it. So actually using technology in peacebuilding is very challenging. There's lots of opportunities, but there are many challenges, and I've broken them down across the 3 key functions. So when it comes to data, I think it's clear that technology allows us to gather data from more people quite quickly. It expands the reach of a data collection process. But when we do that, we have to be quite wary of extraction. You know, collecting data from people is a form of extraction, even if the end goal is noble. And I think when you look at a lot of the early warning, early response work, so early warning systems in conflict, they took technology tools on very early. So a lot of the early conversations around PeaceTech were around early warning, early response, because it suddenly was really easy to gather information about potential warnings. But in a lot of cases, there was no response. So this is a form of extraction. And linked to that, expectations management is really important. So whenever you collect data from people, particularly people in a conflict setting, you're creating an expectation that something will come in return. And I think that when you use a technology tool or a kind of innovative method, this can be exacerbated even more, because there's a sense that this is really something innovative. And we also know, and I know this is going to come up in the next presentation, that there are lots of inequalities in our access to technology. So just because we're using technology to collect data doesn't mean we're actually accessing necessarily more people, or that we have suddenly a universal reach. So it's really important that we sort of cater the technology tool to the specific context. That's why I used the Una Hakika example, because SMS may be just as good as an online crowdsourcing platform for data collection. When it comes to strategic communications, I think it's easy now to disseminate messages through technology. But we're really interested in the creation of messages. So how can technology actually bring people into the creation of messages that then are going to resonate with the people you're targeting? Another challenge is clicktivism. It's very easy now to create a campaign that goes viral, or to create something on Facebook that has loads of likes, loads of shares. But how do we actually know whether that's leading to change? And when we talk about peace, you know, it's one thing to have a successful peace campaign, it's another thing to actually have peace. And so technology can, I think, lead us to a false sense of security that, well, we're doing really well, we've got loads of shares, so we must be nearing our objective. And that's linked to the other point as well about impact. So how do we actually make these communications meaningful when technology is so widespread and when we're so inundated now with messages, you know, coming at us from all directions, including messages about peace? Networking and mobilization. Networks tend to be quite exclusive by their very nature. Often it's not deliberate, but based on the resources we have or the technology that we use, you know, people operate in very sort of specific networks. So when we use a technology, we have to think about who we're actually reaching. And when you think about social media networks, we know that social media puts us into a bubble, that we connect only with the people that we're already connected with. And you can see a lot of work is now happening around depolarization of Facebook. So some of you probably have these plugins that allow you to see your newsfeed from somebody else's perspective. So if you're a Democrat, you can see it from a Republican's perspective, what newsfeed they're getting. These are really cool tools, but they target people who already are aware that polarization is an issue. So I think we have to be really clear about who we're targeting. Are we actually reaching the people that we want to reach? Is Syria bringing in the people to the dialogues that need to be reached through the dialogues? And are we being honest about who we're reaching? And these things all sound kind of straightforward and simple, but we're still seeing a lot of innovation being imposed, external innovation being imposed on peacebuilding initiatives from outside. And I think when this happens, a technology tool or a technology process, it's kind of like a black box. So the community that it's targeting, they don't necessarily understand the initiative. They don't understand where it's come from, what its purpose is. They can't really engage with it. They can't adapt it to their own context. They can't sort of influence the way it's designed. It's just a black box and that's it. And they also can't participate in it. So they're not involved in the design, in the follow-up, in the implementation and the testing and so on. And when you have a black box situation like this, of course you have a trust issue. Communities are not going to trust a technology tool or a technology process if it's imposed from the outside and they're not involved in it. And if they don't trust it, then it's not going to be sustainable. So it's not going to be really embedded in local communities. So to give you an example, a colleague of mine has been working with the National Electoral Commission in Somaliland. And back in 2008, they tried to introduce fingerprint biometric voter registration. And they did this in a very top-down way. So they said, this is the system we're going to use now. And they did no kind of user outreach, no user testing. And the system failed. So there was widespread abuse of the system, fraud, and rejection of the voter lists that were produced out of this. In 2015, the Electoral Commission decided to try an iris scanning voter registration alternative. And this time, they reached out to communities. They talked to them about what they wanted to do. They tested it with communities. They adapted it to local feedback. And it was much more successful, and it's now been adopted as the standard for voter registration. So it went from a black box to something that communities actually could understand, engage with, and ultimately participate in and make happen. So that's one example, but there are others. And I'm going to share now 3 examples of projects that I think have worked in a sense, and try to draw out some conclusions about why they've worked and what we as peace builders and those of you who are academics as research could maybe take from these examples. So I mentioned the Buildpeace Fellows program. These examples all come from that program. So they came from peace builders who were already working on the ground. All of them are local to the specific context. And they had an idea for an innovation, and we helped them realize the innovation. So it really came from them. And an important part of the Fellows program is giving these people the confidence and the space to test new ideas. Because innovation is really hard, and it often leads to failure, or it needs to be very adaptive. And when you're working with local peace-building organizations, often they get traditional donor funding. That can be a big challenge. So a big part of the Fellows program is giving them this space and this confidence. So I start with a project in Burundi. We worked with a local organization who were doing a lot of qualitative research, looking at how youth perceived conflict and development issues in Burundi. And they did a big quantitative survey. So they looked at youth attitudes to human, moral, and civic values in Burundi. This is a really rich data set. And they decided that instead of turning this data into a report and presenting that report to policymakers, they could actually do something much more interesting and more innovative. So they developed a platform which is very user-friendly, it's very straightforward and intuitive, that has all the data in it from the survey, and that allows people to actually view the data, produce graphs, produce maps, visualize it in ways that they will understand. And what they do is they host workshops where they bring together youth and policymakers around the same table. And they sit them in front of this platform, and they get them to play with the data. So it's actually the policymakers and the youth together that decide what data is important, and that discuss why the data is as it is, and therefore talk about what they can do about the data. And I think this is really interesting because we do so much research around conflict, and a lot of the time the analysis takes place outside of the context. It's done by experts. And this can be really valuable, but this is also really valuable because what you're doing is actually having a deliberative process of analysis. So the analysis is actually in itself producing a dialogue between stakeholders that wouldn't traditionally talk to each other. And the results are reflective of local perspectives and views. So it's really interesting. I mentioned at the beginning the animation, the interactive animation series in Syria. And the reason I love this project is because it's trying to get around this thin engagement, this collectivism problem. So it's trying to recognize that reach isn't always enough, and engagement has to go much deeper than just a campaign or a video. it's also really interesting because, the communities are involved in developing the storylines. So the communities involved in creating the messages. And it's very tailored to the local context. So it's all in the local dialect. The people creating the animations are inside Syria. So they're really aware of the contextual sensitivities around this kind of work, which I come to later on. And the third and last example is from Colombia, one of our first Buildpeace fellows. So she was working on the participatory budgeting process. So participatory budgeting is basically where the citizens get to decide on how a proportion of the local budget is spent, so on what kinds of projects it's spent on. And this is really a big issue in Colombia right now because it's part of the peace process between the FARC and the government. So it's been written into the peace agreement that there will be a participatory budgeting process. But there's also a historic trust issue between communities and government in many areas, especially in the more conflict-affected areas. So what Diana has done is she's created this platform which kind of gamifies the process. I don't know if technically it's a game according to your definition, but it basically allows communities to deliberate about projects and vote on projects for the participatory budget. And it's now in the process of being licensed to the mayor of Medellin's office. So they're actually going to use it in the participatory budgeting process. And it's a really important way for trust building to happen because the platform is transparent, it's accessible to all, it's kind of easy to use, and so on. So across all of these examples, and there are so many more examples that I could give, but I'm not going to, I think there are some common threads that make them successful or that, create opportunity. In all of the cases, the innovation and technology was led locally, designed and led locally. In all cases, it was the peace builders that were the product managers, not the technologists. The peace builders, by the way, didn't create any of these platforms. They didn't code them. They don't have the technical skills, but they led the process, which meant they carried the process from start to finish, and they spoke to the developers. They led the developers, brought them in when the time was right, told them what they needed, and so on. And as a result of this, I think all the projects gave a much greater focus to sustainability from the beginning than would happen if it was a technologist coming in and designing something for a specific context. They were really aware of how these projects fit into bigger projects. So in Burundi, for example, part of the design of the platform was also thinking about how this could be used for other research that we do. In Colombia, a big part of it was building relationships with the authorities from the start, so that now that they've tested the product, it's actually ready to be taken on board by the mayor. So this is all kind of sustainability considerations that didn't come after the fact, but that were built in. Communities were brought in at every stage of these processes. So they all took a human-centered design approach, which basically means talking to people in the design phase, in the testing phase, in the iteration, and in the rollout, and in the pilot. And user-centered design really enables you to tailor a product or a process to a community in a way that is much more likely to be embedded and to be responding to their needs. And we talk a lot about do no harm in peacebuilding, conflict sensitivity, but when you're working with local community members, do no harm is something that is embedded in from the start because they're so aware of the contextual risks and they're so able to analyze the potential consequences of what they're doing. In all cases, they were motivated by a commitment to peace and not a commitment to innovation. So these were individuals and organizations who had very clear peacebuilding objectives and who saw innovation as a way to help them reach that objective. Not a commitment to innovation because of it being trendy or there being buzzwords that they could hit or funds that might come if they did something cool. And that's really important. There are a lot of solutions out there that look for problems. And ultimately, a solution looking for a problem is very unlikely to be sustainable, and successful. So if we start with a real problem that's been identified locally, we take it through a design process, and we get to a solution, we have so much more chance of getting to something that has impact. And beware of the hype. So technology is full of hype. Right now it's about blockchain, but it's always about something new. And when you have hype around a technology, you have a race to get to a use case. So now there's a race to get to a blockchain use case in conflict and development. And that often takes us to the black box example, because suddenly there's people developing solutions and trying them out and testing them on communities that often shouldn't be tested on. So I think it's important that we're aware of that. So to conclude, I think technology, I hope I've shared that technology can bring, I think, more participation into peace building, and that's a really valuable contribution. We know that technology, though, can be very disruptive. It alters power dynamics. It changes the way people act towards each other. But if we use homegrown innovations in technology, then they tend to have much more of the cultural and contextual understanding built into the development process, and that reduces risk. So when innovation is done locally, then the peace-building principles of inclusion, transparency, trust building, participation, they're not sacrificed, and risks aren't taken just for the sake of promoting peace tech. So thank you so much.
Okay, and then we have Nanjira Sambuli.
So hi, everybody. I do realize I stand between you and day of close of business, so I'll try and intersperse this with as many smiles as possible and try and crack you up. First of all, Maude, I think we had gone, this is the first day in a really long time I've gone without hearing blockchain. I was doing very well. But now that we're there, I'm going to also drop it like it's hot because it's hot, you know. So yeah, my name is Nanjira Sambuli. I'm currently dealing with fantastic jet lag. I came all the way from Nairobi, Kenya to be with you today and to share this global headache I have on the work that I do. Oh, yay, thank you, yes. This headache is, I'm going to distribute it and decentralize it through the blockchain one day, but until then, I will share it with you in the room. And it's on this notion that it's finally starting to gain traction that, you know, technologies, whether it's blockchain, whether it's artificial intelligence, gaming is great through tech, but none of them are a panacea. And especially to the existing inequalities and injustices in the world. So I feel like perhaps in 2018, for the first time, people are starting to realize this, and especially in decision-making spaces. So that's one part of the headache gone. But that doesn't mean it's all gone, because it mutates. And so as much as we're seeing a tempering of this tech solutionism, I mean, a couple of years ago, you'd open any newspaper, and you'd see new technology will disrupt, will revolutionize. There's a buzzword of activities, and there was always a verb around that, you know, dynamic on what each technology will do. It was this solution. It was the the missing link. And truly, I think all burdens are being cast on the blockchain cross right now, because everybody still wants to carry that thinking, because it's become, over the last decade or so, the deterministic way of thinking about technologies that has made us blind to some of the things that more than others have brought up today. Now, the reality that is tempering this narrative now, and is going to keep tempering it until we learn it, unfortunately for some of us on the receiving end of these ideas, is we know very well that these technologies can either mitigate or exacerbate what already exists in a society. Now, it's a bit interesting to see that with what's happening in the US now is when it's starting, you all are starting to realize what's been going on for the rest of us. I'm here to say you're not alone. We have tips for survival. See us on the side. So just allow me to take just a lateral view, because that's how I do the work that I do. I've been in the innovation spaces. I've been in the not-for-profit world. I am now in a very undefinable tech public policy space at the World Wide Web Foundation that was set up by Tim Berners-Lee to really expand the thinking on how this, especially the web as a technology, could be for everyone. It is the headache to think about. So I'll just focus on two things that intersect here with the whole topic of peace and security. And this is affordable, universal, unconditional access to these technologies, and also how meaningful use gets to be determined as a result. So the affordable, universal, and unconditional access to digital technologies, and allow me to use the example of the internet perhaps as the technology that maybe most of us interact with on some level, really has followed the same structural inequalities that have existed in society. So with the UN global goals of known as the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a lofty one called 9C, that we would achieve universal affordable access by 2020. Good news, we're gonna miss the mark by 22 years. And this is because everybody thought, that deterministic thinking is, or rather the solutionist thinking is what drove the notion. Nobody thought about, well, the digital divides that exist, and especially whether they're geographical, north-south, going by the wonderful framing that was earlier, is following the same structures of inequality and exclusion. So digital divides are an amplification of existing and unresolved societal divides. If nothing else, do remember that. And then even the types of technologies we then have access to and how they enable us to either tinker, to create, or to curate versus just consuming also has impact, and huge impact on this so-called digital economy, and to use the economic language, the factors of production. Here I want to use a very basic example just to give you what a frame of what I mean by factors of production. Today, if you map how the technologies in our hands, and primarily the mobile phone, right from the point of extraction and dumping, you find a lot of that happens on the African continent. So for instance, the extraction of cobalt in the DRC that powers all these devices we have, the latest ones especially, is still being done under the conditions of child labor and human rights violations that either we have become desensitized to, or we've become, over time, people who are okay with reading about the DRC in that particular way. One of the latest articles to highlight this even puts this issue in the frame of an 8-year-old. I think it was on Al Jazeera or somebody, and they say, meet so-and-so who produces the cobalt, an 8-year-old who extracts that for you to use your phone, and here we are, still, doing that. Okay, so we get the cobalt, goes off to China, da-da-da-da-da, comes the e-waste, because, the new iPhone is out, the new Samsung is out, and we gotta dump the old ones. But where do they dump them? One of the world's largest e-waste dumping sites is in Ghana. And there's, again, an article that says, how traders from Europe, US, China, and India actually label the containers with this e-waste as development aid or secondhand products. Now, if you want to look into this a bit further, Al Jazeera did a fantastic photo documentary series on this that shows the children who also then are burning up these e-waste products in a beach near Accra, the capital of Ghana. And you can start reading about the real implications on burning that device as is, some trying to extract little parts they can sell as secondhand, and what's resulting economies and inequalities we're bringing in there. Climate change was mentioned earlier. It has had such adverse implications on, even the marine economy in that country. But these are the things that sometimes in the tech space we are, sort of like the tunnel vision we've been put in, we forget to look into. And I'm just trying today to bring them back here. Now, ironically, again, with the mobile phone, we've seen narratives again being shaped that it's, places like Africa and Asia are mobile first or mobile only continents. You may have read an article or two in your day that says, Africa, the mobile first continent, or Asia, the mobile first continent. But how many of you, and I'm actually just gonna indulge you on this, how many of you have tried to write a paper on a mobile phone? You're academics. So, maybe that's a language you understand. Anyone tried to write their whole thesis? How did that go? Yay, nay? Right. You had a fantastic presentation. Did you create it through your mobile phone? No. So, in the factors of production, we are giving whole continents, devices that are primarily for consumption. Policy is being shaped on this lens that just put first the mobile phones in the hands of the poor Africans and the poor Asians, and all other digital economy things shall be added unto them. But we are creating another divide in terms of what people can actually contribute back into this ecosystem. Mobile apps were all the rage 5 years ago. I am yet to meet somebody who's built a mobile app through a mobile phone. So and then the cost, there's real implications, because the cost between having a mobile phone in my hands today and having this device, and this device, let it stand in for any laptop, the cost between those two is quite huge, because of how policies have been skewed to focus on the mobile phone. So the devices, and whether it's anything that could be used for gaming, any analog parts that would be put together to help create new tools in the digital age, are so expensive in most countries, the cost of importation, the cost of excise duty, that we have created continents that are actually just waiting for the rest of us, or the rest of you, to innovate for them. Yet we are so far removed from those contexts, to Maude's point. That's just one area, right? Let me see if I can bring some more joy in another one. Global governance has been the undercurrent of the conversation today. And I think a big question right now is, what's the role of public sector, private sector, civil society actors in ensuring that all these advances in technology try and get us closer to this dream of equality, and especially in the digital age, which obviously includes global peace and security. But with this, there are power dynamics that we must keep tabs on. That is, while in, I don't want to call it an analog age, but kinda is, before these devices and these technologies and the disruption overall that they've created, it was states that had, we thought, or we imagined, had ultimate power. I mean, it's debatable, obviously. But right now, Facebook, for instance, and I use them loosely as an example because they're our favorite, enemy in the valley. Facebook probably knows more about citizens of any particular country than a government. They have more resources. I think Apple was the first $1 trillion company, some obscene amount of money, more than GDPs combined. The power dynamics and the money dynamics are starting to shift. It is private, non-state actors that are starting to have the power to determine whether we connect in a digital realm or whether we are separated in a digital realm. Now, we've read all the stories, I think Cambridge Analytica, what has been happening with Google trying to introduce a sort of like censorship-friendly version of the search engine in China. If you haven't, please read them, because if we go into one of those, we will never get out of that conversation. I'm just mentioning them as just, context. That for me signals that who we're thinking about holding to account in the digital age is not just states. Now, will we hold these private actors to the UN for the General Assembly to account for themselves as we do states is a question before us today. But they have power over not just the data we are generating, but the custodianship of it, and who can use that data to actually create new tools. In the data is the new oil economy. Now, this particular question is one that is front and center right now with the UN and the Secretary General having set up a new panel. I will not go into how the UN works, but on digital cooperation. And one of the questions he's tasked the panel on which I sit is figuring out what are the mechanisms, how do we bring all these actors together? Whether it's states, whether it's private sector, whether it's civil society, in a cross-disciplinary way of figuring out how to stop the harms that technology is meting out on society. And we have 9 months to figure that out, so maybe the blockchain will help, I don't know. But that's a question, and I'm actually posing it out there to you as well, because if anybody has thought about it, anyone has been writing about it, there's a call for contributions right now for the panel. We really, really could use this. So you can head on over to digitalcooperation.org and just share your views, because some of these questions are not going to be resolved by thinking about technologies alone. And that's been my argument and the argument I put forth today. A lot of what we're trying to resolve through technologies is exactly about the analog antecedent factors in society and how we've resolved them. And there's no tech silver bullet. It will not be the blockchain, but it's gonna cost us a lot of money and a lot of time to figure that out, because we have a fantastic ability to not remember these things. And then, strictly speaking, on the peace, security, and digital realm, two things for me that are starting to emerge that are kind of interesting to follow is the discourse on cybersecurity and the discourse on hate speech/fake news. Newsflash, it was fake news. It existed even before Trump. The rest of us, as we say, been new. We've been new about it. But what's very interesting about how that narrative has come about and what's happening in the way of trying to find solutions is that, one, it did happen in the digital age and social media was weaponized for news and, more talked about filter bubbles and all that. But for some of us in the economies we've existed in, political economies, we've always known that there's going to be 15 versions of events of truth. So now we are all being forced to call it fake news when we've been knew this is a thing, but we're now being restricted through a certain prism to think about it. And resources have already gone into it to try and find the tech silver bullet. Is it an algorithmic twist here? Is it a tweak here? Is it an app there? Is it a blockchain here? Is it, the cloud there? When in truth, it's about society and how we resolve our coexistence. Now, is there an app we're going to build for that? We will again waste a lot of time and money and maybe convene quite a number of conferences where people will display what they have in beta or alpha testing. But in truth, these questions also are age-old questions. And then on cybersecurity, there's such fantastical framing about it, and especially in the media, that is driving, I think, state actors to do something, three things. They're trying to assert their sovereignty now through some legislative means. So you have countries putting down the mark and saying, in this domain, we are going to, make sure there's no encryption because it's bad for security. And you're like, that's nice, but how? Which part? Are you going to go vertically up and say the cloud exists here and therefore, this is a domain you hold? The whole idea of sovereignty is being challenged in the digital age. Not one country can per se say they hold sovereignty over that. Though I won't call it an experiment, but what's happening with Europe is very interesting in terms of how they're putting their foot down on regulating for the digital age. But that is also still being defined as so long as you're a citizen of Europe. So for example, what platforms like Facebook did when the GDPR came about, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, is they said, okay, this will hold. They have the resources to do this anyway, but they said, this will hold for European citizens. So if anything about our data tells us you're a European citizen, we process your data through that mechanism. But for the rest of us, they hold us over they've pushed our data to the American servers they have, even if it costs them more, which is Asia, everyone in Africa, and of course the US. So a majority of people's data is now being routed through American servers because the law does not apply here. And there's a wonderful gift here of very weak privacy laws. So they have the resources to go around that, to bypass that regulation. But states are still trying to do that. Then because of all the challenges that are happening in the digital realm, and especially with cybercrime, we are seeing this seeking of a technological fix. And there's a whole industry, especially derived mostly from Israel and a cybersecurity complex, governments spending tons and tons of money that they should prioritize on other things to buy one tech that they think is just plug and play. But that comes with a lot of intrusive ways to actually keep tabs in the name of national security. There's a whole world of thought and exposés around that, so I will not go into that. But the emerging notion again here is that, and it's really permeating the policy space, is that there are tech solutions out there to be hacked. So it's either a hackathon here, a bootcamp there, a blockchain here, an artificial intelligence, whatever here, that has taken our minds away from the lateral view of how all these things intersect. And there's a need right now for more spaces that call back for tempering. And I think the academic space is one of them. Some of us are trying to find homes for thinking around this because the worlds we are in are being defunded, and that's us as civil society. So as private actors get more powerful, state actors are getting more helpless and gloriously clueless. When, if in doubt, just remember what Zuckerberg said to the senator, and there's a nice gif for those who are internet types, where he actually chuckles back when the senator asks how they make money. That was wonderfully embarrassing. But he says we run ads. It shows you so many people in power, in policy-making spaces, do not know what to do. And if you're really interested in laughing, somebody did create a Twitter thread about if Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before the Senate in Nigeria. I promise you there's a lot of fun stuff in there. But just to show that's what we're dealing with. Much as we find it humorous, we're dealing with a world where nobody knows how to ask questions, and these are the people who determine the laws and regulations in play. We're screwed. I guess that's my message. And then the other thing here is the suspension of, and actually denigration of human rights in the name of national security. There's a lot of what's happening in the name of internet shutdowns when there are events, political events like elections or something, some big news happens. In many countries, the internet is being treated as an on and off switch in the name of national security, because security is being now, determined as this thing, well, first, seek it first in the name of national security, rights can be suspended. So human rights right now is a very difficult language to introduce in many spaces where technology is being discussed. And as a result, people are continuously being treated as laboratories and test sites. And this is particularly the case in the global south. So with the peace and security domain, if nothing else, concern ourselves with how these technologies we already have in society today, the ones that are being conceived, are being situated in existing wider discourses and realities in various contexts in the world. There's been a lot of talk today about, homogeneity of cultures and processes that we use to resolve issues of global governance. As much as technologies like the internet are global, they're also being appropriated in very local contexts, and how we do governance around that needs to carry that forth. But the question, of course, is how. But if nothing else, let's just say, take the lateral view on the use of technologies in society. Please do not get lost in the blockchain domain. But if you do, come back. read a book on history on the side as a footnote. Then we need to shake off this tech solutionism that tech is what is going to solve for all these problems that came before it. And last but not least, as Maude said, the whole notion of bottom-up, appropriate tech innovations and solutions can only be best developed and hacked in the communities that are in the front lines of these challenges. So even if it's that SMS factor, I actually did work on Una Hakika, so it's really, really cool to see it come back up here. Even if it's an SMS platform or it's an Excel spreadsheet in a world that wants to fund virtual reality and whatnot, we need to remind people about the fact that people are not test beds. Technologies are not an excuse or a proxy for dealing with humans. Go back to understanding what these humans have faced and let them tell you how to work with them. Build with them and not just for them. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions, and the microphone is set up if you'd like to come to the middle and ask your questions for the panel. I know they all have lots of questions for each other, so you want to get in early.
Yeah.
I think I have a question for Maude first. And you mentioned Colombia, but I would like you to sort of delve into that a little bit more. What was the project? And was it in Cartagena or Bogota? I'm not sure exactly where that was, but if you can explain a little bit about the project, I think that'd be very good for us to learn about that.
Yeah, sure. It was in Medellin. That's where they're piloting it, with a view to being able to expand it. What it is a tool, I guess a platform. It's like on a computer or a smartphone or a tablet. The idea was to put it in the tablets that are on, there's a cable car in Medellin that connects the sort of poorer suburbs with the main city, and on those cable cars to have it installed there, so people can, it's like a very simple sort of game, and basically users are holders of the budget, of the municipal budget, and they can decide which projects they want to spend money on, but of course they have a limit, so they have to actually themselves deliberate about which projects they want, and they're real projects, so things like a youth center or a football pitch or renovating a local school. So they're real projects and people choose them. And the idea is that it's doing a number of things at once. So it's raising awareness about the participatory budgeting process, because there's often, even though there's this money to be spent and people have a voice and can choose how it's spent, they might not know about it or they might not understand how it works. So it's like simplifying the process. And then it's also actually contributing to the deliberation. So the mayor's office will be looking at the platform to see how people are voting, what people are choosing, how they're playing, and so on. So yeah, it's kind of getting the process out into the community in a way that it wasn't happening before. I mean, before they were doing votes on the participatory budget, but they weren't getting that much input from the community. So yeah, does that?
Yeah, that's good. Because I've heard about another project in Cartagena that's
Okay.
very similar, using, Shark Tank, Shark Tank, the television program.
Yeah.
Using that to sort of develop projects within the inner city. Of course, Cartagena is sort of is sinking, I guess, because of climate change. And a lot of the poor areas in Cartagena is going to be affected by this. So there were a number of projects being developed, but most of them were not tech projects per se, but it sounds very similar to what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a huge topic in Colombia because it's been now ingrained in the peace process.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of experimentation happening in this space, and it's really, really interesting because it's not traditional peace building,
Right.
participatory budgeting, but it has a big role to play, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would like to learn from you a little bit more about the UN's project. So I think you were sitting on that committee, right? I'd like to learn a little bit more about that as well.
I'll give you the after-hours explanation. The Secretary General sets up has a mandate to set up a panel comprising of experts from all sectors. And in this particular case, they want to understand what are the mechanisms that need to be in place that bring in a cross-disciplinary approach to thinking about digital technologies and how they exist in society today. That is to say, how do we make sure they minimize harm to extract the most good? The truth is, I think they're trying to figure out the role of the UN in the digital age and holding these actors to account. What I can say for sure is we will not be recommending another UN body. Lord knows we have enough of those. But you can find out more, again, on digitalcooperation.org, and we definitely need inputs from other actors outside even of the tech realm on how to think about mechanisms of cooperation, because it's all about international cooperation in the digital age.
Is this a project within the UN Secretary General's office?
Yes, it's a 9-month, we've been given 9 months to come up with a report that's supposed to shake the world about this work.
Who are you reporting to, directly to the Secretary General?
Yes, to the SG directly.
Okay, good, good. Thank you.
Any more questions from anyone?
I have a question for Derek. I do understand you can use the games to do peace building, but do you know that we don't have peace at home because of these kids? Yes, they are very engaged. They are very engaged and they're there, but then they really disrupted the whole family. And we as parents, we would want to know, what psychology do you use to capture those kids' mind so we can use it to our benefit so that we can have peace at home? Thank you.
That's a great question. And, I mentioned I have a 2-year-old, and my parents have been just getting ready for me to test all of my idealistic notions about video games and see them be challenged. One thing that I really appreciate about video games, and that I hope my own son will end up experiencing when he plays video games, is that they're actually able to promote some really social collaborative experiences. And the games that I encourage him to play with are ones where he's playing with other people, and you only can succeed by being a collaborative figure. So I might kind of push away the one-on-one Call of Duty fighting games and think a little bit more along the lines of collaborative puzzle solving or things of that nature. And I don't know, at the end of the day, I imagine that it's a balance, right? Kids shouldn't spend all their time on video games. You should probably, give them an hour or two and then tell them to go outside and kick a ball around as well.
I just want to say, there's a really cool game which is about the production of mobile phones. Have any of you played it? Oh, okay, I have to find the name and then I'll tell you. But it's all about the child labor and the poor factory conditions, and iPhone banned it.
Of course.
Yeah.
iOS banned it.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, I'll find the name. And it's a really cool game. Everyone should play.
Thank you for your presentations. Derek, when you came to the slide on America's Army, you were starting to run out of time, so I was wondering if you wanted to take this opportunity to say anything more about that. And just one thing that came to mind as you presented that slide was thinking about I've heard that many of these video games like Call of Duty and Six Siege will kind of end with ads to recruit into the US military. So I was just wondering if you have any comments about that. And then just finally, I would just like to add that, as you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And for many people in Lebanon and many people across the Muslim and Arab world, Hezbollah is a legitimate defense force, right? That is kind of defending southern Lebanon from 40 years of illegal Israeli incursions. So I just mentioned that. Thanks.
Thank you. And that is entirely fair. So thank you for pointing it out to me. I think that it is interesting when the state gets involved in the production of media writ large, right? Whether it's the production of movies or radio announcements, governments are interested in games as well. And just as all of the peace builders of the world are looking at this as a new tool, more and more governments are looking to leverage it as well. The US government is no different, and they've invested a lot of money, something like more than $33 million over the course of a decade in order to build up America's army. Unfortunately, I think a lot of money is going towards games that are more geared towards conflict and getting people to participate or think about conflict from the minds of the creators. And it would be nice to see a different business model where a peace-building game could have $33 million to do the work of shaping people's perceptions and getting people to feel more empathy. Thus far, the US government really hasn't dedicated that sort of money towards that kind of cause.
Okay, so panelists, do you have questions for each other that you would like to ask?
I feel like we met before, and so we asked each other the questions.
So have you seen any interesting answers to that question of like, what are the mechanisms to stop the harms of technology? Like, it's interesting.
The blockchain.
Right. I mean, that's a
I
given.
kid you not. People are literally saying that. So this is a big issue, guys. I'm not even joking.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions from the audience?
I found the name of the game, and it's called Phone Story, and you should all download it. You go through multiple stages of the horrors of creating a phone, and it's really interesting. And if you don't play it, you can read an article about it. It's pretty cool.
Okay.
So I am a little bit of a historian, and I'm very interested in, mostly because my collaborator, Joanne Yates, is very interested in different kinds of communication media over long periods of time. So I'm kind of interested in communication media and the work of the UN and the League of Nations, a variety of things. And I don't know if any of you ever watched some of the big Hollywood films that were made in the 1950s, like A Poppy is Also a Flower and The Story of a Tractor, which included many, they were using all the highest quality Hollywood actors, et cetera, et cetera. DC Comics in the 1950s and 1960s did a wonderful set of comic books that were based on how to create peace and do peacekeeping. They were really quite exciting. There were a really great set of radio programs in the 1920s. Lots and lots of money and they were done in all of the languages of the world, including Hungarian and Bengali, that were going to use the technologies of the day, comic books, Hollywood films, radio programs, to transform peace and establish all of the goals of the League and the United Nations. it's very hard to find copies of, say, A Poppy Is Also a Flower or A Story of a Tractor, even though Spencer Tracy was on that tractor with the UNDP's early views of how to understand how development and peace worked in Afghanistan. Is there any chance that 40 years from now, some of the things that you're looking at in terms of digital technology, gaming in particular, might end up in the same way as things that are little footnotes in history books and perhaps not something that has had huge impact?
Yes. Well, I mean, for a number of reasons, right? You're talking about access to old forms of media. And with games, I think this is a particular problem. So that games that emerged when, gaming hit mainstream pop culture are increasingly difficult to play because the technology that existed to play those games no longer exists anymore. Nintendo no longer supports repairs for the Super NES program, which was like the main games platform when I was super young. And in order to play some of these historical games, people have to resort to piracy. So you download a ROM off of an illegal website and run an emulator on your machine. And to some extent, there's justification for that, just to preserve a bit of history. But it's a little weird that we have to resort to breaking the law in order to protect that piece of history. And the solutions provided by the games creators themselves don't actually work, because Nintendo's solution is just to hold on to the game and then force you to rebuy it every time they release another console. Like, oh, it's Super Mario Brothers Classic. So, yeah, like technology, particularly with games, makes a barrier for historians to interact with older titles. And there are a lot of folks who are concerned about the ability to play technology or play games once the technology dies out.
I think the question is applicable even outside of games. I did some research a while back about link rot, even with just internet links. A lot of what we generate as knowledge today via websites, the moment, I don't know, if WordPress ever goes down, there's a lot of great stories of our times that disappear with it. So there's a lot of work that needs to be brought into the digital age on preservation. Because as much as we're generating a lot, it's going into the hands of these private actors, especially for those in walled gardens. I forgot to mention, in many parts of the world where Facebook is being considered the internet, what is generated within that may never make it outside. So history being created today, solutions being deliberated today, may never necessarily be known outside of that unless somebody carries them outside of that. So that's what's at stake. And I think for every sector, every actor, any academic discipline, there are implications in the digital age that need to be brought up to speed in this realm.